Hi, Ray. I think you might be on mute still. Hey, sir.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, I've been really looking forward to this session. Thanks for joining us here at DevSecCon 24. I think you're bringing a really unique perspective, having come from a dev world and just recently jumped over to the security function. So,
Yeah, it's been fun. The transition has been challenging, but definitely worthwhile. There's so much goodness in the security landscape, things that we have to consider, things that we take for granted, which is the big thing I've discovered. I'm as guilty as everybody. And so when you get into the security world, you start realizing, wow, I'm really not doing what I need to do to protect those endpoints. So I've learned a lot. Hopefully I can share some of that experience and motivate some folks to either think about security within the context of their development, or maybe even get them to transition wholesale into the security world.
very cool. Very cool. Well, I'm going to let you jump into your session here, and I'll talk to you later.
Great, great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Rey Bango, and I'm going to talk about my transition from the world of web development over to the world of cybersecurity. And as you can imagine, the transition, it's kind of wild, it's kind of crazy. In addition, I find this whole virtual thing so interesting, the ability to be able to have a conference presentation and be able to share ideas with a massive group of people. And but if you notice, I have to have a backdrop, because if not, my family will be walking back and forth, and it'll definitely be an interesting type of presentation. But I'm definitely excited about being here. I'm definitely excited about talking about this. For those who don't know, I work for what used to be called the Death Star, also known as Microsoft. So Microsoft is, it's definitely changed quite a bit from what I think a lot of people have used to perceive it as. There's been a dramatic change in the way that Microsoft thinks about technology, about developers, and especially about security. And so Microsoft is a very, very good security company. There's a lot of efforts internally to obviously protect our products, but also to make sure that customers of Microsoft products and just people in general have a secure experience. And so we like to say that we've evolved, and we've gone from the Death Star to a ninja cat riding on a fire-breathing unicorn. And this image is always great. I love this image because it definitely represents the transition that Microsoft has made over the last years into trying to be a little bit more empathetic, I'm going to call it, to developers. Now, mind you that I understand the pain. I led the developer relations team for the Internet Explorer browser. Yes, Internet Explorer. That's to show you how long I've been at Microsoft. And I remember when I'd walk into conferences, I'd give a presentation, and by the end of it, I was walking out like this. I always had my flame retardant suit and was ready to just walk out the event and be blasted, because a lot of developers had that big disdain that for Internet Explorer, and rightfully so. Internet Explorer had to stay, but it kind of lasted a little bit too long. And so there were plenty of jokes out there, here's Chrome and here's Firefox, and they're battling it out, and here's Internet Explorer eating glue on the side. And so, yeah, I got all those jokes, totally funny. And then eventually Edge came out, and God, oh my God, I was so happy, because when I would have conversations about web standards with developers, it was a whole lot easier for them to appreciate the things that we were talking about, because Edge had a lot of those standards in place. And I'm kind of laying the foundation for this, because it's important to understand that as developers, we work to build these cross-browser solutions that can work across multiple devices. And it's really important for the browser to just work. And of course, now there's a whole new Edge, and that's great as well. It's based on the Chromium engine, and so some of those issues that were there in Edge and of course in Internet Explorer now are kind of going by the wayside, and developers can focus really on producing the best experiences possible. But one of the things that I continued to see as I was leading the Internet Explorer team, or Internet Explorer developer relations team, and eventually Edge developer relations team, is that security was something I didn't see discussed often in the developer conferences that I go to. So we would talk about web browsers, we would talk about cross browsers, we would talk about web standards, but application security just wasn't something that was being passed around with developers. And so that kind of struck me, and I developed this interest in security. And I remember that I posted this and I said, I would love to go to DEF CON, but I'm scared to go to DEF CON, and because DEF CON had this reputation of being kind of like a wild scene where everybody's going to hack you and things like that. But the interest was still there. The interest in securing applications, securing people, getting a better understanding of the community was there. And the deeper that I got into it, the more I realized that there was this fundamental gap in knowledge between the developer community and the security community. There wasn't this overlap of conversation. You had some professionals that were really good. They were doing AppSec. You had folks like Tanya Janka and Kevin Johnson who were out there beating that drum on AppSec. But I think, the megaphone just wasn't loud enough at that time to really get the word out. And then for me, the big thing that hit me and where I realized I could make an impact, at least I hoped, is when WannaCry hit. And that was a big deal because I saw hospitals being locked down. I saw ransomware locking these systems and preventing healthcare professionals from providing the care that patients needed, whether it was a cancer patient or dialysis patient or any type of emergency situation. And I sat there and said, what if it was one of my family members? And I really started to think about this and I wondered, what can I do to help out the situation versus just sitting there and talking about web standards all day long? So I dug into it a little bit further. I went to DEF CON, learned a lot, and the one thing that I came away was AppSec is really hard. There's this friction that's always going on between leadership teams who want to build really engaging user experiences. They want to get the product out fast. Then you have developers who are very vested in their code and they want to build solid code. And then you have the IT group, and now which is called DevOps, and they want to have a solid infrastructure. And there's always challenges between all three of them because they're pulling and pushing, and management wants to get it out. The developers want to build the solid code. The IT wants to have security, and there's not this merging in the middle most of the time. And in fact, when you think about IT, I think most IT people think this is what developers do. We're just out there and, sitting in the sun, shining out and having drinks served to us, and while they're busy toiling in the back. In reality, there's a tremendous responsibility for developers. There's a variety of different frameworks that have to be implemented to make the most modern apps responsive and engaging to users. And yes, I'm showing my age in some of these things because some of these, they're not used heavily anymore, like jQuery, but there's still a lot of new tooling that's coming out, and developers want to embrace this new tooling because they know they can build scalable systems that are reliable and they're stable, and they can build these features. But with that, what happens is that there becomes an increased level of complexity, and that complexity adds to the security issues that we're seeing on the application side. And so the IT admins look at us and they're like, oh, hold on a second, you want all this stuff, and that's they kind of frown upon that. And so sometimes we backdoor them and we install it anyways, and then of course they come in and they just strike lightning on us. So it's not an easy thing to balance, and to some extent I can't blame them. If we look at the history of application security, I don't think that as developers we've done everything we can to be really on top of the situation that's presenting itself. And this was a great example of when there was a supply chain attack in NPM. And basically what ended up happening is that somebody decided that they were going to take advantage of, and if I remember, this was a deprecated, and I'm sorry, in this one, this is when a developer left passwords in code, and it was actually be able to see. And then this one is when we had this particular package here called Electron Native Notify, which ended up having a supply chain attack, and it became a malicious payload. So if you were taking advantage of this package, all of a sudden that payload got injected by default into your system when you updated. And that's a scary proposition, because if you're not analyzing the code that's going into your system, you're setting yourself up to be compromised. But here's the thing: if we think about the complexity of our systems, the package management, the CI and CD, and all the steps that go into building these advanced applications, it's hard to verify all the code. It truly is. And they had predicted this was going to happen in NPM, that eventually somebody was going to do a supply chain attack and it would affect a large number of users. And in fact, if you go through here and you look at a dependency graph for this particular module, you'll see what they're talking about. You scroll down and scroll down. Think about if you would be able to actually review every line of code that you are taking a dependency on. When you install React, when you install Angular, when you install any type of package nowadays, most of them take a dependency on another package. And unless you have a really, really great amount of time to inspect the code, you're going to run into something like this where you're going to have this really long dependency chain, and you're just not going to have the time to analyze every bit of code in every one of those dependencies. And in fact, when there was a poll that Sneak did, and they actually asked OS maintainers, and if you look at this, it's kind of a scary graph because it says OS maintainers differ in their code auditing maintenance, and 26% of them said that they don't audit their code. Think about that. Open source is a critical aspect to software development nowadays. There's no way around that. But if you're taking a dependency on open source, how do you know that those maintainers are actually auditing their code, that they're doing their due diligence to make sure that that code that you're relying on is secure? And that's the problem. We have this thing called implicit trust, where we assume that everything that's on NPM, everything that's open source, is just safe. And we shouldn't. We really, really shouldn't. And this reinforces, again, Sneak again, saying, how do you find vulnerabilities? Well, 36% said we use dependency management and scanning tools that notifies us. That's great. But here it is right here. 27% said I probably won't find vulnerabilities. That's a very scary proposition. And I'm guilty of this, by the way, because I developed in a variety of languages. I developed obviously in JavaScript and Node, and using Node and using NPM. And I've done these things. I've depended on the dependencies, these packages, and just took it for granted until I got into security and I started really looking deeper into this, and I saw the gravity of the problem. And we do have a big problem. So there was Dark Reading did a great article on this, and if we read through this real quick, it says each web application that Positive Technologies inspected contained 33 vulnerabilities. And of those, 2/3 of those apps, 67% contain critical vulnerabilities, such as insufficient authorization errors, arbitrary file upload, path traversal, and SQL injection. Now, mind you, if you look at the OWASP top 10, SQL injection is still #1. Why is that? After all this time and all these technologies that we have, why is SQL injection still the #1 thing? And being a developer, I have to say is sometimes I think we tend to be in such a rush to get things done that we overlook some of the granular details of the things we're doing. Some people say developers are lazy. I don't think that developers are lazy. I think developers try to streamline things as much as possible, and in the process of trying to streamline the work that they're doing, sometimes they overlook these things. And a SQL injection or a path traversal vulnerability, it can be catastrophic to a company. So we continue on, and Veracode, and we saw Chris Weisopol during one of the ads, and he's a big advocate for application security. So I loved the fact that Veracode put this out, and that they found just 52% of components that these app developers use that they polled. Let me read that. Veracode polled 400 app developers from the UK, US, and Germany, and found just 52% update components when a new vulnerability is announced. That means that either they're not taking the steps to patch things, or they don't know about it. And either way, that's a bad thing. I think as application developers, it's critically important that we start thinking with a security mindset. We start understanding, what does it take to build secure software? And we can't allow ourselves to get into the situation where we don't understand where components are now vulnerable. We can't put ourselves in a situation where these things are announced, whether it's through a CVE or some other form of public disclosure, and that we're not aware of that. And what I do love is that companies are like Sneak and Veracode and White Source are stepping up to help us become more efficient and secure developers. And the reason I'm really happy is because, to be honest, web apps and APIs are the new attack endpoints. When you think about hacking and you think about hackers and all that stuff, you always think that they're hacking the network and they're going into some low-level protocol and they're just doing Mr. Robot magic stuff. And having gone through courses that teach me both web application pen testing and also network pen testing, I can tell you that's not the case. The likelihood that a medium experienced hacker could break into a network is very slim because so many companies are now going cloud native. And that means that the infrastructure side is becoming much more secure. When they do hack, it's usually a misconfiguration. It's not like they created some novel kernel exploit that they're super wizards. It's usually a misconfiguration. But that's becoming far few in between and harder to find. And especially when you have things like bug bounty programs, which are out there proactively testing. I do feel for the small and medium-sized businesses, though, because they don't have the teams in place that allow them to do this repetitive type of testing, this iterative cycle of testing and fixing and testing and fixing. And so I think some of the things that I'll talk about later on in this presentation will hopefully address some of that for small and medium-sized businesses. But it's really important to think about web apps and APIs now as being that new target for hackers, because the mistakes that you make, whether it's a path traversal or SQL injection or cross-site scripting or something like that, can allow full system access to a very experienced hacker, somebody who understands how to get into web apps and capitalize on that to open up a particular web shell, for example. Now, I think as developers, we do have to think about security. And the first place that I'd recommend people to go to is go to the OWASP site and review the OWASP top 10. This from 2017. And that was the most recent one came out, and that's 2020. And I'm going to show you the list of the top 10 in a second. But I want to keep this link out there for a second because I think it's important that as developers, we get familiar with how security is viewed within the context of applications, especially web applications. So please go to owasp.org and start looking over the material there. I think you're going to be shocked by what you find. I think you're going to be impressed by what you find. And it actually might motivate you to start getting your hands a little bit dirty when it comes to security. There's a whole ton of best practices in there, along with applications that are vulnerable that you can test your skills out. But we'll get to that in a second. I'm going to point out some of those. If you look at the top 10 in terms of security, again, injection vulnerabilities are number one. And that's SQL, no SQL, operating systems, LDAP systems. Why is that in the year 2020, we continue to have these things? And again, I attribute it to the fact that we have so much demand from leadership teams, from IT, and also I think we're also becoming very reliant on third-party frameworks without truly understanding what's going on under the hood to ensure that we have security in the system. We can't be reliant on third-party frameworks to protect us. As developers, we have to really think about what we're doing when we're accepting data, when we're putting data out there, how we're interacting, and how we're allowing other people to access the data that we're storing. You know, with GDPR now, it's critically important that we protect that PII as much as possible. The number of breaches that I read about that are in plain text floors me. And I think as developers, we need to get familiar with encryption. We need to understand that encryption is critical to protecting the data that is so important to our customers, in our company, to the livelihood and to the safety of people. There's no reason why anybody should be storing plain text data nowadays when encryption technologies are so simple to implement in many cases. Encryption data at rest should be just a standard principle that we abide by. And this comes into thinking about security from the very beginning. One of the things that the DevSecOps community loves to talk about is shift left. It's moving your mindset and all the way to the left of the development process so that security becomes part of the whole entire cycle, not just at the end of it. It shouldn't be an afterthought. We should be considering security at the requirement stage, the design stage, coding, testing, and release. Our CI and CD pipeline should have some form of security auditing and analysis capability. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I think it's going to be a hard pill for some to swallow, but you're like, oh my God, I already have so much work, and now I have to be a security expert. I don't think you need to be a security expert. I think you need to be security savvy. And the great thing is there is a lot of automation happening now that's meant to help developers become more proficient in identifying these issues that could compromise your apps. And so when we talk about that, we talk about automation a lot. We automate so many things. Webpack automates our build of our application. We talk about Jenkins for deployment and Kubernetes and all these things that automate our life, our development life at least. Why not automate some of the security and leave it to professionals who truly know what they're doing? The ones who their whole world revolves around securing systems in some fashion. And so you look at this graph from WhiteSource. And so before automating your open source, over 75% were aware to only 50% of their open source inventory. Now think about that. Think about how much open source you ingest every single time you build an app. And how many of you actually know what you're ingesting wholesale? What is it that do you know every module that's getting brought in? Some of you may say, yeah, I know them all, and that's great. More power to you. But how many of you truly know how much open source software you are bringing in, especially when you're taking advantage of things like PyPy for Python, their package manager, or NPM. How many of you know what's being brought in? And so, it's a scary proposition when you think that 90% have at least one vulnerability and over 45% have 5 and up in their apps because they're not aware of the inventory they have and they're not doing any type of auditing. It's a really scary proposition. Then, the licensing issue is a whole different world, and that's just compliance. If you're not thinking about compliance and what the licensing terms of open source software does to what you're building out, that's a whole nother conversation to have with your legal team. You should definitely think about that. And I love the fact that companies like Sneak are actually thinking shift left. They are looking at the end-to-end. And I think of this more of like a round trip type of thing. They are thinking from the coding all the way to the deployment and reporting stages. And I think that's really critical that their systems are providing that level of coverage so that as a developer, you can have that dynamic analysis of code using something like, Visual Studio or JetBrains. And that it can integrate with version control systems like GitHub and GitLab, and it works across Docker and Kubernetes and Heroku and all these things. This is critical. It's critical that you consider these types of automated systems because they provide this type of functionality. And you want this type of insight. In this case, WhiteSource is providing you with a dashboard that can help you analyze not only the vulnerabilities that you have within your code bases, but also any compliance issues you might have. So yes, I am an advocate of using some form of automation because I know that I can't do it by myself. I just can't. There's just too much code to analyze. And if there are systems in place that can automate that for me and allow me to scan my code and at least provide me with a 10,000-foot view of the landscape, not only can I help to solve those problems, but I can also work with leadership to make greater investments in solving these problems. I can show to them, this is what could happen if I don't patch these 27 vulnerable libraries. That's something that's very powerful when you're thinking about how do you present this to your leadership and your management chain. And even GitHub, I love the fact that GitHub now is incorporating some of these bits of functionality directly into the version control system. And so with you have something like Dependabot, which Dependabot will look at your dependencies and it will actually alert you. It'll send you an email and it'll actually notify you on the version control system, the dashboard, and say, hey, you have something that's either out of date or that it's vulnerable. And I think that's really, really important for developers. Now, if you're a developer and you just kind of look at it and ignore it on a production, something that's a production system, then obviously the onus is on you. But it's there. And I'm not sure if a lot of folks have turned on these features. I'm not sure if folks even know they're there. And I think that's more of something that as a company, GitHub, Microsoft, we need to do more to get that out. And that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to bring this in there. And in fact, the fact that we're now incorporating CodeQL into Visual Studio Code, now you can do dynamic analysis of code bases directly within Visual Studio Code. And that's amazing. This is the type of stuff that will help streamline your development process in terms of security. You want to be able to identify these issues. You want to be able to solve them quickly before it gets out of hand. And of course, to further on, we GitHub, and I say we because GitHub is part of Microsoft now. GitHub acquired NPM, and this is a big deal because it shows that NPM was such an important aspect in developers, such an important service in developers' lives that security had to be really, really stringent and considered. And I love that Adam Baldwin is now with GitHub. Adam actually ran security for the Node project. He actually ran the Node security project before, and then came over to NPM, and now is with GitHub. And so there's a lot of great talent that are looking into the security issues of package management, especially around NPM. And of course, we have other great companies out there that provide solutions like Veracode and Qualys and Black Duck. All of these have mature solutions that can certainly help you out. But I think ultimately, one of the things that's going to be a big deal is for a company to start identifying security champions. And I really like this term. It's identifying people who are willing to step up and take that stand and say, I want to help build secure systems and I want to help educate others in building secure systems. I want to be that advocate for security. Jerry Bell said it perfectly. He says, I would summarize what I heard Ian say is that InfoSec needs to build bridges to better communicate with DevOps. And that seems right. One of the major challenges I find is that developers often lack the perspective of the adversarial mindset. And I agree 100% with this. And the reason is because I'm living proof of that. I didn't have that adversarial mindset. I didn't know what a true hack was until I actually transitioned to security. And then I actually played with stuff and I learned the techniques and I understood it. But here's the thing, becoming that adversary, and yes, this is the very typical overstock type of, cyber criminal person. Yeah. But before I developed that adversarial mindset, I had to get some of the training. That's where the training is hard because there's just so much out there. This is actually what it looks like to find a training class on the internet. You're sitting there and you're just getting blasted, whether it's YouTube, whatever. And there's just so many options out there. So when I decided to look through that, I actually wanted to get a dedicated course. I'm very much a hands-on learner, and so I ended up with Hacker House, and Hacker House was fantastic. They gave me the foundational skills I needed to understand how web app pen testing occurred, but also how network pen testing occurred. And by having both, it gives me a really solid base for how I can protect the applications that I build, but also what would happen if somebody actually got through. How would an adversary go from a web app into the network and then start moving along the network to critical assets? Having that mindset is what's going to allow you to become a better developer, a more secure developer. And I would urge you all to consider taking some form of course, whether it's in person or something like eLearn Security that's online. Or if you have very deep pocketbooks, you can go to SANS. They have great material too. They're a little pricey, but their material is world-class. I tend to also buy a lot of books, and these are some of the books that have dramatically helped me. The Web Application Hacker's Handbook, from a developer perspective, is probably the book that most people recommend. And I have to say, I agree. It gives you an understanding of some of the vectors that these bad actors will look at to get into your systems. and perpetually try to compromise you. And they're going to do it. Once you put a system out, it's going to be probed. It's going to be, people are going to try to get into your software. Now, taking a course, reading a book, that's all fine and dandy, but you know what? Unless you are actually practicing your craft, unless you are actually going out there and practicing these skill sets of how an adversary works, you're not really going to get a feel for it. And this is what I love about OWASP. OWASP has taken the time to create materials, tools, and applications actually that you can hack, and you can hack legally. OWASP Juice Shop is a Node.js application using Angular. It's fantastic for testing out things like cross-site scripting, SQL injections, request forgeries, stealing cookies, all that fun stuff that you would do as a web app pen tester and also as a cyber criminal. And so I would urge you to take a look at the OWASP Juice Shop project, along with the Dan Vulnerable web application. This is an oldie but goodie. It's been around for a very long time, but it's definitely worth looking at. I'd also recommend, if you're getting into more of DevSecOps, to take a look at the DevSlop project. This is another one that's really great for those who are more into understanding how to secure the end-to-end of everything from the code, but also to the CI, to the deployment, things like that. And that's where DevSecOps comes in. And I think it's really important that we consider how all those components tie in together. How do you actually protect code, but then once you get it out of your developers' hands, how do you administer identity, access rights, deployment rights? Who can touch code once it's been approved and audited through your CI/CD? All those things come into play, and that's where DevSecOps is really critical. The one thing I will say is that if you decide that you want to get into security, build a very strong network. I know it's easier said than done, and a lot of folks will say, well, what do you mean build a network? Why should I do that? I just want to code. I think it's critically important to build that network of people who have an understanding of the areas that you don't, especially in terms of security. And that's how I was able to transition. I reached out to a lot of people I never met and just asked them for advice. I wanted to understand the things that were important to them, the things that they saw in the security landscape. It was critically important for me to do that, but also it was very valuable because I met a lot of folks that were way smarter than me that taught me some of the ropes and pointed me in the right direction. So I would say reach out to people in the security space who are doing the things that you would like to do, and then learn from them. And for those in leadership positions that are hiring, don't assume that you have to hire a security person. Look for non-traditional talent, people who you see have tenacity or have a very special set of skills that can translate over into a security world very easily. And that was kind of what happened with me. I had this developer experience, and Ann Johnson, the person who hired me at Microsoft, she saw something that had potential. And I had no security experience, but she gave me some things to do. She said, look, I want to see progress on these things. Show me you can do it, and then we can talk. And I went out there. But had I not had somebody who could see the potential in a non-traditional person, I might not be in security today. And so I would urge you all, if you're a hiring manager, to please consider folks in non-traditional roles. Give them the opportunity, look at their skills, and figure out where do they fit. The bottom line is, though, when it comes to security, if you really want to do well, then you got this. It takes some effort. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. Shifting left doesn't happen overnight. Embracing different tools doesn't happen overnight. Auditing all your code doesn't happen overnight. But if you take the time to really think it through and come up with a good plan and capitalize on the experience of security professionals and security companies who've already been there and done that, you can get yourself into a really solid, secure position substantially quicker. Look at services like Secure Code Warrior. Look at services like Sneak, White Source, GitHub. All these systems are in place not only to train you, but also to secure your code base. And with that, I thank you very much for allowing me to give this presentation.
Yeah, that was a great tour there, Ray. I feel like You really consumed a lot of resources in your short time in security. How long have you been at this in the security function? A year and a half?
I think I'm going to be completing 2 years in this. So yeah, there was a lot of sleepless nights.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, so thanks for sharing. Let me just check the chat real quick. If you got any questions for Ray, he's got a couple minutes here. He might be able to answer that developer perspective on joining the security function. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned looking for development talent, maybe outside of the normal security functions. I think that's a great recommendation for security teams. That's an easy way to bridge that gap, right? You can get a developer. Maybe they don't even have to be the most senior developer, but just somebody with that tooling and that environment that they're used to working in. Bring them on the security team.
It is, and it's interesting because I think so many people get hung up on experience, and yeah, experience is definitely valuable. I don't want to dismiss that, but I think it's also important to understand that there's a gap of 3 million cybersecurity professionals in this world, in the world. There's that need, and so you're not going to find 3 million people who have 10 years of experience in cybersecurity that are just ready to go. The people who are really good are hired. And either you're going to throw a boatload of money at them, or you're gonna have to look for other avenues to get people up to a level that you need. And there's so many great training resources nowadays that you can take somebody who is a software developer who maybe has some of the DevOps experience and say, please go learn and help us. And I think what ends up happening is that a lot of companies feel like there's an inherent risk in training somebody. You train somebody to get them really good, and then they leave you. And that's a risk anytime. It is what it is. But I think ultimately, if you train somebody and you treat them well and you treat them professionally, you minimize that risk if somebody's going to leave. I'm going on almost 10 years now at Microsoft. Wow. And so I know I'm probably like a unicorn because I don't think most people stay that long, but we do have a lot of people that have been at Microsoft for a very long time, some in excess of 20 years. And the reason is because if companies treat you well, they invest in you, they invest in training, that's where people decide to stay. So I hope that's not a fear that people have. I would say it's worth more to invest in your people and make sure that they have the skills to help you do what you need to do. And if security is one of them, find that person who has a passion for it. And there are a lot of people that have approached me and said, I want to go into security. How do I do it? Just invest in them. Give it a shot. And if they leave.
So you mentioned the OWASP, the OWASP Top 10. You mentioned the Juice Shop project. You also mentioned Hacker House as a resource for skilling up. So yeah, if people are looking for any of that, I think they could also follow you on Twitter. It looks like a couple people do. So you're probably dropping resources here and there on how to get skilled up from a dev to a security perspective.
I do. I try my best. And I actually wrote a series of articles on ethicalhacker.net. And so I have a column there, and I haven't written in quite a while. I have to write some more. I just dropped an article recently, and it's going through the editorial process. But as I've become better and more experienced in cybersecurity, it's interesting to see the disconnect that we have between what management perceives. And when I say management and I say developers and ops, it's because there is this big disconnect. Everybody thinks they're siloed buckets and they don't want to talk, and it's still pervasive. I think smaller companies have an easier time because they don't have that many people, and so people just want to talk with each other. But when you're in larger companies, there's these big silos, and breaking down those silos and having security champions who can communicate with each other on terms that they both relate to, that's a huge thing. That's a huge thing.
Awesome. Well, thanks for spending all this time with us here at DevSecCon 24, and it was great information. Thanks for sharing all that.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me. This has been great. Have a great day to everybody, and hopefully this is valuable to you all.